It's no exaggeration to say that this might be the single most important watch I've ever had in my hands. This is the exact watch, the single piece that really changed the entire watch world. Perhaps the most important single contemporary horology specimen. The watch I have to share with you is the stainless steel URWERK 103 prototype. To understand what makes this watch so important, we have to go back in time a little bit. So let's say we're in the end of the 90s, beginning of the 2000s, and the watch landscape is pretty bleak before that. It's kind of very traditional watches. The industry is starting to revise classics. Perpetual calendars, tourbillons, split-second chronographs, a lot of grand complications, a lot of this idea of kind of layering complications together in classic cases to make expensive watches. And people had gotten a little bit fatigued of this idea. So now we take it for granted that there are all these companies that make these kind of crazy cases with crazy time-telling indications and these really inventive things. But back then, there really were only two. Now, the reason why there were two is A, it was incredibly risky. Nobody really wanted this stuff. It was kind of a class of watches that people, most of the industry, scoffed their noses at and thought, this is way too crazy. But also, in order to even play in this area, you needed a lot of credibility. And there were only a few guys that really had enough credibility that they could break into this. Now, what do I mean by credibility? Well, in that time, you really had to be a watchmaker to start your own independent watch brand. So now there's a lot of guys that are product designers or even just CEOs, finance guys, mechanical engineers, all these ancillary things, and you can create a brand and you can kind of hire whoever it is, the guys that you need to fill in the gaps in your own knowledge. But in the very beginning, to get somebody to pay tens of thousands of dollars for a radical watch from a brand that nobody's ever heard of, you had to be a watchmaker with real bona fides. And that left really only a handful of guys in the world, and they were all in a group called the AHCI, which basically stands for the Academy of Independent Watchmakers. Now, this was a group run by watchmakers to honor really great watchmakers, and amongst them, two mainly stood out. So you had Vianney Halter, who, if you're familiar with my channel, you will have seen his Antigua and his Classic. The Antigua was his main breakthrough watch, and this was extremely influential. Vianney's kind of fatal flaw is that he's a very eccentric guy and was kind of never able to keep up with production and really create a brand. So he's had a big impact on the horological world for sure. However, not nearly as much impact as our next guys, and that is URWERK. URWERK is fairly unique amongst all watch brands in that it's actually a collaboration between watchmakers and artists. You have on one side Felix Baumgartner, and in the beginning his brother Thomas, and they were raised by a vintage clock and watch restorer. Their grandfather also was in that business, and they were very accomplished watchmakers themselves. Felix was an AHCI member, and he was working mainly for Vacheron Constantin and then for Sven Anderson, who was the founder of the AHCI and a very important independent watchmaker. And on the other side, you had Martin Fry. Felix and Martin met at a party, and Martin was an artist actually, and they started talking about sort of crazy watch ideas, and that's how URWERK came together. Now, in the late 90s, they launched their URWERK 101 and 102, which were sort of dipping their toes in the water of this crazy scene. They were round watches. Okay, the 101 has a little bit different lugs that make it not totally round, but in general, classic round watches, 36 millimeters, and they had sort of a linear display of time A lot like the Audemars Piguet Star Wheels at the time, and that was sort of all you saw, and they were very cool, and they caught some people's eyes, but overall they weren't a very big success. It's at this point in the story that I'll let Felix Baumgartner himself take over. This is a quote from him. "We are struggling around the table. The company's bank statement is lying on the table. That is all we have after 5 years of hard work. 5 years of struggling to give life to our dream, but achieving very limited success. We've already come very close to stopping a few times before, because of orders canceled the day before delivery and components being too expensive to afford. We feel like we're on a big emotional roller coaster, euphoria one day followed by depression the next. Today we are in the hollow. We have finished the design of our new watch, but have barely enough money to put it into production. We are card players sat around the poker table. We can either put everything into the pot and risk it all on one throw, or admit it is too hard and call it a day. We have to make a decision. Now. First vote around the table, then a second round. URWERK is clinically dead. It makes absolutely no sense to continue. It would be stupid. We look at each other. Surely it cannot finish like this. Let's go to the end. We find faith. URWERK is not dead. The UR103 will live." And this gives you a real insight into what it's like being an independent watchmaker. The URWERK 103 was put into production, the piece that would really change the landscape of modern horology and, of course, change the complete future of the brand. So let's go again to Felix Baumgartner in his own words about this launch. "We are cruelly conscious of the fact that this is make or break time. We have faith in our latest creation, the UR103. A new complication with its time indication using rotating hours on satellites, a work in 3 dimensions, with another world first on the back of the watch, the control board. The case is a modern piece of sculpture. We know that we put our absolute best into this creation. The only concession is the steel case, but we could not afford an expensive gold case. But the piece is finished, and we feel that it is as beautiful technically as it is aesthetically. We are conscious of the fact that it is a timepiece for sophisticated and knowledgeable collectors. Our UR103 is for true lovers of horology, and we had that very much in mind when we created it. But will they understand? 4 p.m. and we receive our first order. This is the highlight of all my 28 years. I feel as though I am the king of the world." Again, really cool insights as to what it's like being an independent watchmaker at this time. He talks about just this first sale, but the 103 ended up sending ripples through the horological world. Ian Skellern writes on Quillen Pad, "Without exaggerating the importance of this model, I feel it's fairly safe to say that the UR103 both transformed URWERK from being a barely viable niche player in modern watchmaking into one of the most influential and well-respected of independent horlogerie brands. It also led to the Opus V for Harry Winston, then helmed by later MB&F founder Maximilian Bucer, considered by many to be the best of the seminal Opus collection." Okay, so now you have this connection. URWERK 103 goes straight to Max Bucer, and let's listen to this in Max's words. "In a few years, I predict that one will look back and see that the world of high-end horology is divided into 2 periods, before URWERK and after URWERK. I was fortunate to meet Felix Baumgartner and Martin Fry during Basel 2003, when they presented to me the first prototype of their UR103. At the time, I was managing director of Harry Winston Rare Timepieces. It hit me hard. Very, very hard. I felt it was a truly incredible timepiece. Although not many others appeared to share my perspective at the time, URWERK had clearly opened a door that no one had even thought existed before. That initial amazing meeting was the beginning of a formidable adventure, which culminated in URWERK making the sensational Opus V for Harry Winston, a timepiece which made a huge impact on contemporary high-end watchmaking, and a watch which, I have to admit, I'm very proud of. So the Opus V then becomes the main piece that gives Max the confidence to leave Harry Winston and start MB&F, and this is now the whole direction of MB&F. Okay, so all of this comes right back to the URWERK 103 launch. And here it is, the exact one mentioned in all of these pieces. You can see here, it's marked number 1, and it is stainless steel. Now, let's again go back to Felix's words. He says, "Given the budget, we were only able to complete the prototypes in steel. To make a gold case would have been too expensive. The cost and time frame to complete the 103 before the annual Basel trade show was so tight, we even had to use the basic plastic hands that are included when purchasing base caliber movements for the subdials located on the back of the watch. So that's these little hands on the control board he's talking about. See how they go right next to each other and almost hit? He goes on to say, the hands were too long to function correctly with the movement running. He says, my brother and I simply cut the tips off the plastic hands to fit correctly. For the power reserve indication, that's this right here, we wanted the triangle point at the tip to be red. My brother's girlfriend at the time was using a nice red nail polish, so my brother used her nail polish and dipped the tip of the hand to make it red on each of the prototypes. How crazy is that, guys? This is actual history in the making. Otherwise, what we have in this watch is a fairly simple 103. Now, the other thing that made the 103 so important is that it really became a proving ground for all of URWERK's design ideas. The model lasted for 7 years, and in that time, they explored lots of things. They opened up the top with crystals here so you could see all 4 satellites. They used all sorts of different materials. But the most important is that in the beginning, it had to be gold. If you go back to 2003, it was very, very rare to have watches like this in the first place. And the idea of selling a watch that had to be this expensive in a steel case was unheard of, right? Now it's kind of trendy to put expensive watches in steel or titanium cases. But back then, if you were gonna have to spend a lot of money on a watch, you wanted a precious metal case. So that's why they were a little bit self-conscious about this, and they had to make this prototype in steel, even though the final watch was gonna be in white gold and in rose gold. And so they made this exact one. They showed it to retailers at the fair. They ended up getting a very substantial order from an important world retailer. And he, as part of his order, very astutely convinced them to sell him this prototype. Now, they needed the money, and they basically couldn't refuse, as his order is what more or less kept the company alive. So they sold him this prototype, and that's why it exists. Otherwise, these things, first of all, they very rarely get made, prototypes like this, fully functioning, and especially in metals that the watch was never made in. But if they do, they're almost always kept by the brand. So in this case, history conspired to let this incredibly, incredibly interesting and important watch into the wild. In this watch, we start to see a lot of the really important URWERK design tropes. So it's the first where you have these 3-dimensional satellite discs. It's a 4-arm system. This is used in almost every URWERK after this, some kind of variation on that theme. In addition, you have the control board. The control board is where they put extra indications. So in the URWERK 103, you have a running seconds back here. You have a minute. So this is used to precisely set the minutes. See on here, you have the 5-minute indicators mainly laid out, but if you want to get precise on it, it's easier to flip to the back and see it there. This is a power reserve, as we discussed earlier. And this is pretty cool. This was a screw that is connected to the rate keeping adjustment, and you can actually make your watch run a little bit faster or slower just from this external screw, so you don't have to open up the movement. All of these things became standard on URWERK 103s, and almost every other URWERK built after that had some form of a control board on the back. The other design element that is in almost every other URWERK is this very large crown at 12 o'clock. This was the first time it was seen again, and it really makes the watch a pleasure to wind. It's a manual wind watch, of course, and you pull it out one click to set the time, and the time is on these satellites. It's basically a driver's watch. You can read it from straight on. You can also read it from straight up, so it's pretty practical in that way. But as the 9 fades off, the 10 comes down, and here you have 10:15, 10:30, etc. I'll show you the watch on the wrist. It has almost a cool, like retro futuristic vintagey vibe at this point. It definitely doesn't look old, but it doesn't look new either. It's kind of unclear what time period this watch would be from. But if you know modern URWERKs, this definitely has a sort of vintage look and feel to it. And the steel itself has picked up a very cool patina over time. It's an incredibly comfortable watch to wear, really easy to read the time. Of course, being in steel, it's a lot lighter than its white gold or rose gold counterparts. And so it's just a really comfortable watch on the wrist, and one that you can wear. You know, it's a museum piece basically that you can actually wear and use, and nobody would ever really know that it's even different than a normal URWERK 103. Not that anybody knows what an URWERK is out in the world, but even if they did, they wouldn't know that you're wearing a piece that could very easily be in any horology museum across the world. As you can see, this watch has got me really excited. I mean, this is the tip top of importance level when it comes to contemporary horology. This is the area that my entire life has now been focused on, and kind of this is where it all began. So, boy, talk about special. I know I have special stuff on this channel, but this is like another level. I hope that I was able to kind of explain a little bit about URWERK. I hope you understand a little bit more about the brand and the history of contemporary horology. And I'm so happy that I was able to get my hands on this to make this video to share it with you guys, because there's only one.